that so much need that opportunity.
The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, my original question asked the Minister of National Revenue about a Canadian company, Turquoise Hill Resources, that operates a very large, very profitable mine in Mongolia. The company is based in Vancouver and listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And now a report from the Centre for Research on Multinational Corporations explained how Turquoise Hill used a so-called mailbox company set up in Luxembourg to avoid paying about $690 million in Canadian taxes over a period of 6 years. The same report also suggested that Turquoise Hill Resources avoided paying hundreds of millions of dollars of taxes in Mongolia, but I want to concentrate on the Canadian side of the story here. Now, coincidentally, there was a long opinion piece in the Globe and Mail today about this very report, written by a tax lawyer who wanted to make sure that people didn't frame this as tax dodging or tax cheating, but simply a story of a Canadian company doing what it was legal to do, or as the Supreme Court has ruled, the taxpayers have the right to order their affairs to minimize tax payable. Now, this isn't a one-off case, and I'm certainly not suggesting that it's illegal. Turquoise Hill acted within Canadian laws to lower its tax exposure. It even got a tax ruling from the Canada Revenue Agency that assured them their scheme was fully approved. And this is the crux of the problem, and this is what concerns me. It's an example of how Canadian tax laws allow companies and individuals to legally avoid paying billions of dollars in taxes, and why we should act to limit that practice. And now you can certainly debate about what a fair amount of taxes would be, but when a Canadian company pays nothing or next to nothing in Canadian taxes on profits it made in this country, but shipped offshore to a mailbox, something is clearly wrong with our tax laws. And this is a big problem for Canada. Some analysts have calculated that offshore tax havens funnel $10 billion to $15 billion every year in tax revenue to countries with very low tax rates. It's a major part of Canada's lost tax revenue, which has been estimated by the Conference Board of Canada to be as much as $47 billion every year. The Government of Canada should be looking seriously at ways to remedy this huge problem. Now, I was recently talking to a major Canadian money manager and tax expert, and he brought up the subject of tax havens as a serious problem and suggested a straightforward solution. Write tax treaties so that companies must pay a minimum amount of tax at a reasonable rate if they are reporting foreign income. So you could set a reasonable rate, say at 20%, still well below Canadian rates, so that if a Canadian company reports $2 billion of income in Luxembourg and Luxembourg levies taxes at 4%, that company would pay 16% in Canada. There are likely other ways to tackle this, but we really have to do something. Thank you.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important when members from opposition raise issues of this nature, they often get into the specifics. They'll name a particular company. And it is important that we actually note that there is confidentiality provisions of the Income Tax Act that actually prevents us from discussing the circumstances of individual taxpayers or corporations. Now, having said that, I've been a parliamentarian now for 25 plus years, and one of the things that I have always experienced is this expectation, justifiable expectation that Canadians have as a whole, that there is a sense of fairness in taxation. And there is a frustration in terms of when you get this perception or reality of the tax inequities that are there today. And that's why what I would encourage my friend across the way is to recognize that we have some problems today that have been in place for many years. And what we do is we have a Prime Minister that is actually taking the issue of taxation head on. Virtually from day one, Mr. Speaker, trying to look in terms of how it is our middle class and those aspiring to be a part of it, those that need that helping hand, how it is that we can ensure that there is a heightened sense of tax fairness. So, for example, one of the first initiatives that we would have seen was the special tax on Canada's 1%. I'm sure even my New Democratic friends will acknowledge that at least they have argued in the past that we need to apply and put more taxes on Canada's wealthiest 1%. Well, we've already done that. That was one of the first initiatives. Then we looked at lowering taxes for Canada's middle class. Then we also took a look and said, well, what about those that are aspiring to be a part of the middle class or the working poor? We brought in programs that would in fact put more disposable income in their pockets, such as the enhancement of the Canada Child Benefit Program. Now, the NDP, and this gets to more so to the question, will talk about tax evaders. And, you know, like members in the NDP benches, Liberal members are also offended by those tax evaders. We also want to see a higher sense of accountability from corporations or individuals, and I'm not being specific by listing those names, but I can say in general it offends us when we have individuals that go out of their way to avoid paying their fair share. Tax evaders. And Mr. Speaker, this is something in which, as a government, we have seen, again, the Prime Minister working with the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Revenue responsible for CRA and actually investing real dollars, significant dollars. I believe this year alone it's over $150 million. In the last 3 years, it's close to $1 billion. $1 billion to go after the people that are trying to not pay their fair share of taxes. So we have a government virtually from day one trying to be able to improve the system. We need to recognize that many of the types of initiatives that my colleague or friend across the way might want to see the government act on today, we are going as quickly as I believe that we can. In certain areas, we need to look at what other countries are doing because you need a collaborative approach because it's a worldwide problem. That means we need to work with other governments around the world in certain situations, Mr. Speaker.
Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Parliamentary Secretary talks about tax fairness. And what this government has been doing is spending $1 billion going after the little fish, going after small corporations, small businesses, and individuals across Canada, getting very little in return when they could be going after the big fish, when they could be going after CEO stock option loopholes that would net maybe $800 million every year to our tax revenues. And in terms of tax havens, what have they done? They're signing new tax treaties with the Cook Islands, with Grenada. And, you know, tax treaties are ostensibly drafted and signed for legitimate reasons. They're set up so that Canadian companies that actually does work in another country isn't taxed twice. If a Canadian company actually made $2 billion in profits for work it did in Luxembourg, it should pay those taxes in Luxembourg. But that's not what's happening here. And I'm using this example just because it is an egregious example that is in the news. Turquoise Hill is a mailbox in Luxembourg. Luxembourg made millions of dollars in tax revenue simply by recognizing that mailbox. This is not what tax treaties were meant to accomplish. In fact, the use of mailbox companies to gain illegitimate access to tax treaty benefits is considered by the OECD as a treaty abuse, and it has to stop.
Parliament Secretary.
But, Mr. Speaker, I would argue that in many ways, these tax treaties that the member is making reference to enables the CRA, if not directly, indirectly, to be able to withdraw more information. And we need that information, at least then, to ensure that there's less tax avoidance. You see, the member is wrong on the assertion that this government is going after the little guy. This government is going after individuals and corporations, all of those that are actually going out of their way to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. And that's what that close to $1 billion, it might even be just over $1 billion with this recent addition of $180 million. This government is aggressively pursuing individuals and corporations, not just little guys, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about huge sums of money. There's a commitment from this Prime Minister to continue working with the Minister of Revenue and the Minister of Finance to ensure that we have a more fair taxation system, and that is something that we will continue to strive for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The motion to